Michael Harper stood at the window of his modest home, sipping his second coffee of the morning. The backyard was quiet, his twin daughters playing in the distance, their laughter blending with the chirping of birds. It was a scene of idyllic family life, but today, something felt off. His wife, Rachel, had been unusually silent since breakfast, retreating into their bedroom with a vague excuse about catching up on emails. He brushed it off as another symptom of her recent stress. She often complained about the pressure of running her bakery, especially with the holidays around the corner. Still, there was an unease in Michael's chest that he couldn't shake. He turned away from the window, setting his mug down on the kitchen counter, when the sound of an approaching car drew his attention. A sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. Michael squinted, trying to make out the driver. His stomach tightened when the door opened, and out stepped his younger brother, Ethan. The man was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, flanked by two others carrying briefcases. Lawyers. Michael's breath hitched. What's he doing here? Michael muttered to himself, quickly heading for the front door. Ethan rarely visited unannounced. Their relationship had been rocky for years, a mix of sibling rivalry and unspoken grudges that neither had fully addressed. Ethan was the golden boy, the charismatic one who had inherited their father's business acumen, while Michael had chosen the quieter path of teaching history at the local high school. Despite their differences, Michael had always tried to keep things civil. But this was far from civil. Ethan stepped up to the porch, his usual charming smirk replaced with something colder. He wasted no time. We need to talk, Michael. Michael's eyes darted to the men behind Ethan, their expressions impassive but professional. What's going on? Ethan glanced past Michael, toward the house, then back at him. Inside. I think you'll want to sit down for this. Rachel was already in the living room when they entered. She sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Michael noticed her avoidance of his gaze, the way her eyes flicked to Ethan before quickly looking away. Ethan didn't wait for an invitation. He took a seat opposite Rachel, gesturing for his lawyers to remain standing by the door. Michael remained by the armchair, his arms crossed. Care to explain why you're barging in here with lawyers? Michael demanded. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I came because Rachel owes me something. A promise she made to me years ago. Rachel flinched, her hands clenching tighter. Michael's stomach churned at the implication. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice sharper now. Ethan's eyes bored into Michael's. Your wife promised me a wild night. The words landed like a slap. Michael froze, disbelief etched across his face. What the hell are you saying? Rachel's voice broke the tense silence. He's telling the truth. Michael turned to her, his voice trembling. What truth, Rachel? What is this about? Before Rachel could answer, Ethan leaned back, pulling a folder from the briefcase beside him. He opened it with deliberate precision, sliding a sheet of paper across the coffee table toward Michael. You've been raising my kids, Michael. Not yours. The twins, they're mine. The room spun. Michael's knees buckled as he sank into the armchair. His trembling hands reached for the paper, his vision blurring as he read the words. DNA test results. The scientific precision of the numbers mocked him, ripping apart the foundation of the life he thought he'd built. You're lying, Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. This has to be fake. I assure you, Ethan said calmly, those results are legitimate. I made sure of it. Rachel's sobs filled the room. Michael, I'm so sorry, she choked out. I've been lying to you for years. It was never supposed to go this far. I swear, it wasn't about love. It was about money, Ethan finished for her. It's always about money. Michael's hands curled into fists, his voice rising. You're saying this was all a game to you? To both of you? That my entire marriage, my family, was just a, what? A con? Rachel's tears flowed freely now. It wasn't like that, Michael. I never meant to hurt you. Ethan, ever the opportunist, pressed on. Look, Michael, this isn't personal. But legally, I have rights. I'm here to assert those rights. My lawyers have already drafted the necessary paperwork. You can leave this house peacefully, or we can make this ugly. Michael's gaze darted between his wife and his brother, the betrayal cutting deeper with each passing second. The house he had built with Rachel now felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything?" Michael spat. "This is my home. My children." "They're not your children," Ethan said coolly. "And as for the house, well, that depends on how much you want to fight. I'm sure the courts would love to hear about the fraud your wife has been committing." Rachel buried her face in her hands, her muffled cries the only sound in the room. Michael's mind raced. Years of memories flashed before him, the birthdays, the bedtime stories, the first steps. The love he'd poured into his daughters wasn't something that could be erased with a DNA report. But the pain, the betrayal, the sheer audacity of it all, it was overwhelming. "What's your endgame, Ethan?" Michael asked, his voice barely masking his fury. "Why now? Why come here like this?" Ethan stood, straightening his suit. "Because it's time to set things right. You can fight this if you want, but I guarantee you'll lose. Think about it, Michael. Is it worth it?" He turned to Rachel, offering his hand. "Come on. Let's give him some space." Rachel hesitated, her tear-streaked face a portrait of anguish, before slowly rising. Michael watched in stunned silence as she took Ethan's hand and followed him down the hall. Toward the bedroom. It was as if the world had shattered around him, leaving Michael in the ruins of his once perfect life. The door to the bedroom clicked shut. Michael sat frozen, the reality of what he had just witnessed refusing to sink in. The house, his house, felt alien now, its warmth replaced with a suffocating chill. His heart hammered in his chest, rage bubbling beneath the surface, tempered only by the fear of what he might do if he let it spill over. He glanced back at the DNA report on the coffee table, the words, excluded as the biological father, glaring at him like a cruel taunt. His daughters. His beautiful, vibrant daughters. Could it really be true? The thought made his stomach churn. Through the thin walls, he could hear muffled voices. Ethan's deep, commanding tone carried faintly, though Michael couldn't make out the words. Rachel's quieter sobs followed. The realization struck him like a physical blow, they were planning their next move, right here in his home. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to storm down the hall, but something rooted him to his seat. "Think," he muttered under his breath, dragging a hand down his face. "Don't lose your head. Not yet." He needed answers. And more importantly, he needed a plan. Hours later, the house was eerily quiet. Ethan and his lawyers had left, though not before delivering a thick stack of legal papers, now sitting untouched on the dining table. Michael didn't read them. He wasn't ready. Rachel had retreated to the guest room after their confrontation, leaving Michael alone in the master bedroom. The bed they'd shared for years felt cold and empty, its familiar comfort replaced by the weight of betrayal. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a message from his best friend, Colin. "Game night still on this weekend? Let me know." Michael stared at the message, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. How could life outside this house still seem normal when everything inside it had imploded? He set the phone down without replying, leaning back against the headboard. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside his mind. He replayed the events of the day, each detail sharpening his anger. Ethan, swaggering into his home like he owned it. Rachel's confession, her tears, her silence as Ethan spoke for her. The way she'd taken his hand, and walked away without a backward glance. The more Michael thought about it, the clearer one truth became: this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. And if they thought he'd roll over and accept it, they were dead wrong. The next morning, Michael rose early, driven by a restless energy he couldn't contain. He brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the dining table, staring at the legal documents Ethan's lawyers had left behind. The cover page was a demand for him to vacate the house within 30 days. Ethan, it seemed, was claiming ownership of the property, a technicality buried in the paperwork from when Michael and Rachel first purchased it. A clause Michael hadn't noticed at the time, but Ethan clearly had. Michael flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening with every clause, every stipulation that painted him as an interloper in his own life. By the time he reached the end, his hands were trembling with barely restrained fury. The sound of soft footsteps drew his attention. Rachel stood in the doorway, her hair unkempt, her face pale. She clutched a mug of tea, her fingers white-knuckled against the ceramic. She looked at him, but he refused to meet her eyes. "Michael," she said quietly. "We need to talk." "Talk?" He barked a hollow laugh. "Now you want to talk? After everything you and my brother dumped on me yesterday, now you think we should have a little heart-to-heart?" Her shoulders slumped, but she pressed on. "I know you're angry." "Angry?" He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Angry doesn't even begin to cover it, Rachel. You lied to me for years. You let me believe those girls were mine. You sat there and watched me love them, raise them, while you knew." His voice cracked, and he turned away, gripping the back of the chair to steady himself. "They are yours," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Maybe not biologically, but in every way that matters." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare try to spin this into some kind of noble lie. You stole years from me. You and Ethan both." Rachel set the mug down, her hands shaking. "You have every right to hate me, Michael. But please, don't take it out on the girls. They love you. They don't know anything about this, and they don't deserve to be caught in the middle." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Despite everything, his love for his daughters hadn't wavered. They were innocent in all this. But that didn't change the fact that his entire life had been built on a lie. "I need time," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Time to figure out what's next." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Take all the time you need." Michael spent the next several days in a haze, avoiding Rachel and burying himself in research. He called in sick to work, spent hours poring over the legal documents, and reached out to a lawyer of his own, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Angela Pierce who came highly recommended. "Your brother's claim on the house is flimsy," Angela said during their first meeting. "But the DNA test complicates things. He could argue for partial custody of the girls if he's determined enough." Michael's stomach turned at the thought. "What are my options?" Angela leaned back in her chair, studying him. "We fight. But I'll warn you, Michael, this is going to get ugly. If your wife and your brother are working together, they'll pull out all the stops." Michael nodded grimly. "Let them. I'm not giving up without a fight." Angela gave him a small, approving smile. "Good. Because neither am I." As the days stretched into weeks, Michael began to piece together a plan. He started digging into Ethan's life, using every resource at his disposal. What he found shocked him. Ethan's business ventures, lauded in public as wildly successful, were teetering on the brink of collapse. Lawsuits, unpaid debts, and whispers of shady dealings painted a very different picture of the man who had walked into Michael's home with such confidence. It was clear now why Ethan wanted the house, and why Rachel had gone along with his scheme. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about survival. They were using him as a pawn in their game, and they expected him to fold. But Michael had other plans. Late one night, as the house lay silent, Michael sat at his computer, crafting an email. He attached the documents he'd gathered on Ethan, every damning detail he could find, and addressed it to several news outlets and business watchdog groups. His finger hovered over the send button, his mind racing. He paused, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. About exposing the truth. With a final surge of resolve, he pressed send. The storm was coming. And this time, Michael would be ready. Michael Harper had always been a man of quiet resolve. He believed in logic, in fairness, in fighting his battles with calm precision. But as the days turned into weeks and the magnitude of his betrayal sank deeper, that resolve began to crack. He wasn't simply grieving a lost marriage, he was fighting for the very essence of his identity. And with every new revelation, the man he had been, trusting, generous, forgiving, felt like a distant memory. The first crack came the day Ethan showed up at the school where Michael worked. It was lunchtime, and the teacher's lounge was abuzz with the usual chatter. Michael was nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee, reviewing a lesson plan, when he spotted Ethan standing in the doorway. The sight of his brother in a tailored suit, flashing that practiced smile, sent a wave of cold fury through Michael's veins. Ethan didn't belong here. This was Michael's sanctuary, one of the few places that still felt untouched by the chaos unfolding in his life. Michael rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room fell silent as his colleagues glanced between the two men, sensing the tension. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. Ethan spread his hands in a mock gesture of peace. "I'm here to talk, brother. Privately." Michael's jaw tightened, but he motioned toward the hallway. He wasn't about to air his dirty laundry in front of his coworkers. He led Ethan down the hall to an empty classroom, closing the door behind them. "Make it quick," Michael said, crossing his arms. "I have work to do." Ethan leaned casually against a desk, as if he were the one in control. "I came to offer you a way out." "A clean break." Michael scoffed. "A clean break? After what you've done, you think there's a clean way out of this?" Ethan's smile faltered, replaced by a harder edge. "Listen, Michael, I get it. You're angry. You feel betrayed. But dragging this out in court isn't going to do anyone any good, especially not the girls." The mention of his daughters made Michael's fists clench. "Don't you dare bring them into this. They're already in it," Ethan said, his tone softening in a way that felt almost patronizing. "Look, I know you love them. And I'm not trying to take that away from you. But you and I both know they deserve stability. Fighting over custody, over the house, it's only going to hurt them in the long run." Michael stared at him, the audacity of his words almost laughable. "You're unbelievable, you know that. You destroy my marriage, waltz into my home, and now you're pretending to care about what's best for my children." "They're my children," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "And whether you like it or not, I have a right to be in their lives. You forfeited that right the moment you decided to sneak behind my back and sleep with my wife." Michael's voice echoed in the empty classroom, the raw emotion he'd been holding back finally spilling over. "You don't get to play the victim here, Ethan. Not after everything you've done." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Finally, Ethan straightened, his expression hardening. "You think you're the only one who's been hurt by this? You don't know the whole story, Michael. You don't know what Rachel's been through. What I've been through." Michael laughed bitterly. "Enlighten me, then. Tell me how you and Rachel are the real victims in all this. I could use a good story." Ethan shook his head, his frustration evident. "I didn't come here to fight. I came to make things right. You can hate me all you want, but at the end of the day, we're still family. And I'm willing to help you start over. Sell the house. Split the proceeds. Move on." Michael took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can buy my forgiveness? My silence? Let me make one thing clear, Ethan, I'm not walking away from my life. Not without a fight." Ethan's jaw tightened, his carefully constructed mask slipping just enough to reveal the man beneath, the one used to getting his way, no matter the cost. "Have it your way," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Michael alone in the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, Michael sat in the darkness of his living room, a bottle of whiskey on the coffee table in front of him. The house was quiet. Rachel had taken the girls to her parents for the weekend, a move Michael suspected was more about creating distance than a genuine family visit. The silence was deafening, a reminder of how empty the house felt without the laughter of his daughters. He poured himself another glass, the amber liquid catching the dim light. His lawyer, Angela, had warned him against drinking too much during this process. "You need a clear head," she'd said. "The moment you let your emotions take over, Ethan wins." But tonight, Michael didn't care. The whiskey dulled the ache in his chest, the gnawing sense of loss that had become his constant companion. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen, half expecting another text from Ethan, but it wasn't him. It was Angela. "Call me when you can. Just got some interesting info on Ethan's finances." Michael stared at the message, his pulse quickening. Angela had been digging into Ethan's business dealings for weeks, trying to find leverage. If she'd found something, it could be the break Michael needed. He dialed her number, the whiskey forgotten. Angela answered on the second ring. "Michael," she said, her tone brisk. "I've been going through the records you sent me, and I think we've got something. Ethan's business empire is hanging by a thread. He's leveraged to the hilt, and if even one of his investors pulls out, the whole thing comes crashing down. Michael sat up straighter. How does that help me? It gives us leverage, Angela said. Ethan's counting on this house as collateral. If we can prove financial misconduct, fraud, embezzlement, anything, he won't just lose the house. He'll lose everything. Michael felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by doubt. How do we prove it? We keep digging, Angela said. But I'll need your help. You've known Ethan your whole life. If there's a weak spot, you'll know where to find it. Michael nodded, determination hardening his resolve. I'll find it. Good, Angela said. And Michael? Don't let him intimidate you. Men like Ethan only have power because people let them. Take that power away, and he's nothing. As Michael hung up, a sense of purpose began to replace the despair that had been consuming him. Ethan thought he'd won. He thought he could manipulate and bully his way to victory. But Michael wasn't the same man he'd been before. Ethan had declared war. Now, it was Michael's turn to fight back. The next morning, Michael was up before dawn, his mind racing with the weight of Angela's revelations. Ethan's empire wasn't as untouchable as it seemed. The thought gave him a grim sense of satisfaction, but he knew satisfaction alone wouldn't win this battle. He needed to act. Sitting at his desk in the study, Michael flipped open his laptop and began pulling up every piece of information he could find about Ethan's business ventures. Old emails, shared family records, even social media posts, anything that might reveal a crack in Ethan's carefully polished facade. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but Michael hardly noticed. His focus sharpened as he pieced together a timeline of Ethan's rise to power, high-risk real estate deals, sketchy partnerships, and rumors of kickbacks to local officials. Some of it was hearsay, but there were enough breadcrumbs to suggest a pattern. And then Michael found it, a single document buried in an old shared drive from years ago. It was a property agreement, signed by both Ethan and Rachel. Michael's breath caught as he scanned the file. It was for a land purchase Ethan had made a decade earlier, one he had listed as a major success during family gatherings. But the document told a different story. The property had been sold at a massive loss, with Rachel listed as a guarantor. Michael leaned back in his chair, the pieces falling into place. Ethan hadn't just manipulated Rachel emotionally, he'd tied her to his financial schemes. If this came to light, it wouldn't just ruin Ethan's reputation. It could drag Rachel down with him. Michael's chest tightened. As much as he wanted to make Ethan pay, the thought of Rachel being collateral damage gave him pause. She'd betrayed him, yes, but she was still the mother of his daughters. And despite everything, a small, stubborn part of him still cared about the woman he'd built a life with. He picked up his phone and dialed Angela. "Find something?" she asked, her voice brisk. "I think so," Michael said, forwarding her the document. "This could be the leverage we need, but it might implicate Rachel too." Angela was silent for a moment. "That's a complication," she admitted. "But it also makes Ethan vulnerable. If he knows you have this, he might back down to protect her." Michael hesitated. "I don't want this to turn into a scorched earth situation. I just want my life back." "Then we need to play this carefully," Angela said. "Let me dig deeper into this agreement. There may be a way to use it without dragging Rachel through the mud." "Do it," Michael said. "And Angela, thanks." "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We've still got a long road ahead." That evening, Michael returned home to find Rachel sitting in the living room. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. "Where were you?" she asked. "Out," Michael replied curtly, brushing past her. "Michael, please," Rachel said, standing. "We can't keep doing this, living like strangers in the same house. We need to talk." Michael stopped, his back to her. "Talk about what?" "How you lied to me. How you let my brother destroy everything we built. Or maybe you want to talk about how you plan to walk out of here with him and leave me with nothing." Rachel's voice trembled. "I didn't plan this, Michael. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen." Michael spun around, his anger flaring. "You had an affair with my brother for years. You lied about our children. You signed deals with him that could have destroyed us. Don't stand there and tell me you didn't mean for it to happen." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, but Michael didn't let himself soften. "Do you even regret it?" he demanded. Or are you just sorry you got caught? Rachel took a shaky breath. I regret everything. Hurting you, lying to you, all of it. But I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't care about Ethan. He was there for me when you weren't. Michael felt as though she'd punched him in the gut. When I wasn't, he echoed. I was working my ass off to provide for this family. Everything I did was for you, for the girls. And you threw it all away for someone who doesn't care about anyone but himself. Rachel sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. Michael stared at her, the woman he'd loved, the mother of his children, now a stranger in every way that mattered. Maybe you can't, he said, his voice hollow. Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed. The next day, Michael met Angela at her office. She looked up from her desk as he entered, her expression grim. We have a problem, she said, sliding a folder toward him. Michael opened it, his stomach sinking as he read the contents. It was a countersuit, filed by Ethan. He was accusing Michael of defamation, claiming that the emails Michael had sent to the press were baseless and intended to ruin his business. This is retaliation, Angela said. Ethan's trying to scare you into backing down. Michael clenched his fists. It won't work. It's a bold move, Angela said. But it also tells me he's desperate. He wouldn't risk this kind of public fight unless he thought he was losing. Michael looked up at her, determination burning in his eyes. Then we push harder. Angela nodded. I'll file a motion to dismiss. In the meantime, I've got a forensic accountant going over Ethan's finances. If there's anything illegal in his dealings, we'll find it. Michael left the office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan had made this personal, and Michael wasn't going to back down. That night, Michael sat in his study, reviewing the countersuit. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up to see a message from an unknown number. Careful, Michael. You don't want to make enemies you can't handle. Michael stared at the message, his blood running cold. It wasn't hard to guess who had sent it, or who had put them up to it. But instead of fear, he felt a spark of defiance. He typed a reply, his fingers steady. Bring it. As he hit send, a new thought occurred to him. Ethan wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to hide something bigger than Michael had realized. And Michael was going to find out what it was. The threat hung in the air like smoke, suffocating but intangible. Michael read the text message again, careful, Michael. You don't want to make enemies you can't handle. Before deleting it. He wasn't about to be intimidated, especially not now when the tide was finally starting to turn. In the days since Angela had uncovered Ethan's financial vulnerabilities, Michael had become relentless. Every free moment was spent combing through records, calling in favors, and feeding Angela anything that might tighten the noose around his brother's empire. Ethan thought he was invincible, but Michael knew better. The cracks were there, just waiting for the right pressure to make everything collapse. And then the break came. Angela called late one night, her excitement barely contained. We've got him, she said. Ethan's been funneling money from his investors into a personal slush fund. The records are sloppy, offshore accounts, fake invoices, the works. It's textbook fraud. Michael's heart pounded. Are you sure? I'm sure, Angela said. And better yet, I've got a contact at the DA's office who's very interested in taking this case. Ethan's going to be looking at prison time if this sticks. Michael let out a long breath, the weight of months of anger and betrayal finally starting to lift. What do we do now? Angela's voice turned steely. We wait for the DA to make their move. In the meantime, Ethan doesn't know we have this. Use that to your advantage. Michael nodded, a grim smile forming. Oh, I will. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. 2 days later, Ethan showed up at the house unannounced. This time, he came alone, his confident demeanor replaced by a thinly veiled desperation. Michael opened the door, leaning casually against the frame. Didn't expect to see you here, Ethan. What's the matter? Lawyers not returning your calls? Ethan forced a tight smile. We need to talk. Michael stepped aside, letting him in. The irony wasn't lost on him, Ethan, the man who had tried to take everything, now seeking a private audience. Michael led him into the living room, where Rachel sat on the couch, her expression a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion. Rachel, Ethan said, his voice softening as he approached her. Can we have a moment alone? Rachel glanced at Michael, who gave her a slight nod. She stood and left the room, casting one last uncertain look over her shoulder. Ethan waited until the sound of her footsteps faded before turning to Michael. This needs to stop, he said, his voice low and urgent. Michael arched an eyebrow. You'll have to be more specific. You know what I mean, Ethan snapped. The press, the calls from investors, it's all coming back to me. I don't know what you've done, but you're sabotaging my business, and it's going to destroy both of us. Michael leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. Funny. I seem to remember you marching in here, lawyers in tow, ready to destroy me without a second thought. How does it feel to be on the receiving end? This isn't a game, Michael. Ethan's voice cracked, the mask slipping. If my business goes under, it'll take Rachel with it. Do you really want that? Do you want the girls to suffer? Michael's eyes hardened. Don't you dare talk about my daughters. You lost the right to use them as leverage the moment you tried to take them from me. Ethan paced, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. For the first time, Michael saw the cracks, the sweat on his brow, the tension in his shoulders. The invincible Ethan Harper was unraveling. What do you want? Ethan asked finally, his voice quieter now. Name your price. Michael smiled coldly. I don't want your money, Ethan. I want the truth. Ethan stopped pacing, his expression guarded. What truth? The truth about why you did this, Michael said, rising from his chair. Was it just greed? Jealousy? Or was it something else? You've been lying to me my whole life, Ethan. You owe me this. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, to Michael's surprise, he sat down heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Ethan said, his voice muffled. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. Rachel and I, it just happened. At first, it was a mistake. But then. Then you saw an opportunity, Michael finished for him. You saw a way to take everything from me. The house, the kids, the life I built. Ethan looked up, his eyes haunted. You always had the life I wanted, Michael. The family, the stability. Everything came so easy for you, and I had to fight for every scrap. I thought if I could just have a piece of it, I'd finally be happy. Michael shook his head, disgusted. So you tore it apart instead. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan said. I swear. But things spiraled out of control, and now I don't know how to fix it. Michael stared at his brother, the man who had caused him so much pain. For the first time, he saw him not as the confident, larger-than-life figure he'd always been, but as a deeply flawed, broken man. You can't fix this, Michael said, his voice cold. But you can face the consequences. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen, revealing a recording app. The screen showed the timer ticking up, Ethan's entire confession, captured in perfect clarity. Ethan's eyes widened. You recorded me? Michael nodded. You're going to withdraw your claims on the house and the girls. You're going to walk away quietly, or I take this to the DA. You wouldn't, Ethan started, but Michael cut him off. I would. And I already have more than enough evidence to bury you, Ethan. This recording is just icing on the cake. Ethan slumped back, defeated. What do you want from me? I want you out of my life, Michael said. Out of Rachel's life. Out of the girls' lives. For good. Ethan nodded slowly, his face pale. Fine. You win. Michael's lips tightened into a grim line. This isn't about winning, Ethan. It's about doing what's right. Ethan stood, his movements slow and heavy. He turned toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at Michael. But Michael didn't look away, his gaze unwavering until Ethan finally left. Rachel found Michael in the kitchen later that evening. She stood silently in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously. Is it over? She asked quietly. Michael nodded. It's over. Rachel hesitated. And us? Michael looked at her, his expression unreadable. I don't know, Rachel. I don't know if we can ever come back from this. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and walked away. As Michael stood alone in the quiet house, he felt an odd sense of peace. The storm had passed, but the scars it left would remain. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, he felt in control. And that, he realized, was enough. What would you have done if you were in Michael's shoes? Would you have confronted Ethan earlier, or played the long game like Michael did? Could you have forgiven Rachel, knowing the depth of her betrayal, or would you have walked away entirely? And what about Ethan? Do you think he deserved a second chance, or was Michael right to cut him out for good? Share your thoughts in the comments. What choices would you have made in this tangled web of betrayal and revenge?